used to go to visit my granny a lot over in the Glens of Antrim in the north of Ireland. It's a really beautiful, beautiful place. Mountains and beaches and I loved it there. It was my second home, and it still is in a way, really. I still go there a lot to visit cousins and stuff. Sometimes I stayed there for the whole summer, 3 or 4 months at a time, and it did feel like home to me. Now, once in a while, I would see, coming up the Glen Road that ran just past my granny's farm, this little old woman, and I was really frightened of her, not because she was old, but because, at the same time as being really old, she was smaller than me when I was 7, and I thought that wasn't the right way of things when she was such an old woman. So I used to keep out of her way. If I used to see her coming up the Glen Road, I used to hide behind the bushes and watch her, and I was convinced that this old woman was a witch. And I'll describe her to you. She stood like this, and she had her back bent, and she held in her hand a stick, and she had around her head and her shoulders a shawl, so you could hardly see her face. But when I did get to see her face, I saw that it was full of wrinkles, and I was terrified of her. And I used to watch from underneath the bushes as she walked past with her stick going tap, 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 tap. But one day, I was playing on the gate to the farmyard, and I was swinging on it and climbing on it, and I was so engrossed in what I was doing that I didn't see the old lady coming up the lane. And suddenly, I heard the tap, tap, tap of her stick, and I turned round and nearly fell off the gate because there she was, right beside me, this little old witch. And I ran into the yard, and I ran into the house, and I slammed the door shut, and I said to my granny, who was doing something in the house, I said, "Granny, there's a witch outside." And she said, "Come on out and show me this witch." I said, "There's no way I'm going out there. There's a witch, and she'll turn us into something awful." And my granny said, "Well, come to the window and let's look at this witch as she walks past." So that's what we did. And my granny took me to the window that looked into the lane that went past her little farmhouse, which is still there, by the way. My cousins live in it now. And we saw the witch walking past with her stick going tap, tap, tap. I said, "There she is, there's the witch." And my granny said, "That's not a witch. You don't have to be afraid of that little woman because she won't harm you at all. She's not a witch. Her name is Liza McKillop, and she lives just down the lane, and she's a neighbour of mine, and she won't do you any harm whatsoever." I said, "But why is she so small, but yet she's so old? She's got to be a witch." And my granny said, "No, the reason that she's so small is because when she was a little girl, something very special happened to her. She went to live with the Faeiries for a while." And I thought, wow, you can go and live with the Faeiries. And I said, "How did she get to do that?" And my granny told me this story. She said, many, many years ago, when Liza McKillop was 6 or 7 years old, she was in her house one evening, just as it was beginning to get dark, when her daddy said, "Liza, go out and bring the cows in. I'm going to smoke one more pipe and then I'll milk them. I'll come to the shed. If you let them into the shed, I'll go out and milk them when I've had my pipe." Now, Liza McKillop had brought the cows in many times, and it wasn't really a difficult job as you'd think. You know, all you need to do is open the gates, the cows come in, they know the business, they know what to do. So he sent her out to get the cows in, and he smoked his pipe, and then he knocked it out on the mantelpiece, and he went out to do his work. But as soon as he stepped into the yard and looked into the meadow, he saw that the cows were still in the meadow, all clustered around the gate, looking a little bit angry because they wanted to be milked. And he thought, why has she not done as I asked? She's left the cows in the field. And he called out, "Liza!" But she didn't answer, and he thought, she's hiding. She knows she's in trouble. She's not done as I asked. She's in for the high jump when I catch her. And he got the cows in and he milked the cows. And then when he'd finished all that and got them back into the field, by now it was beginning to get dark and there was still no sign of Liza. And he started to look for her in the meadow, calling her name, looking in the bushes, thinking she was hiding. But he didn't find her. But the rest of the family came out and joined in the search because it was getting dark. And the neighbours from across the fields, they heard them calling her name and joined in. The farms in that glen, even today, are still very small farms. And pretty soon, half the glen was looking for Liza McKillop. All through the night they looked. And by morning time, word had gone out that Liza McKillop was missing. Before long, the whole glen and all down around the headland into the next glen, Glen Ballyamen, people were out looking for little Liza McKillop, this little girl who'd gone missing. And days went by and the search continued. They looked along the river, along the low fields, up onto the mountain waterfalls, but they didn't see any trace of this little girl. And weeks went by, 3 weeks in all. And at that stage, people were beginning to fear the worst. And a group of the men were up on the high mountainsides among the crags at the top, and they were looking to see if she'd wandered that high. And they were taking a little rest. And one of the men, he said, "Do you know, it's like she's banished from the world. It's as if the fairies have taken her away." And when they mentioned fairies, well, her dad, who was with that group of men, looked a little bit uncomfortable. And one of the men, he said, "Have you done something to annoy the fairies?" And her dad, he looked really guilty and he said, "Well, I cut down a fairy bush, a fairy tree." Now, I don't know if you've heard of fairy trees, but there's certain trees in Ireland, usually a hawthorn growing in a certain place and in a certain shape, that belong to the fairies. And if you touch those trees, it's considered really bad luck. He'd done more than just touch one, he'd cut one down. He said, "It was banging me wheel, I got sick of it in the end. For years it's bothered me, that tree. I lost my temper, and I took my axe and I cut down the fairy bush." And the men said, "Well, that's what the problem is. They've taken her away in revenge. You've got to make your peace with the fairies." And there's different stories about what he actually did to make that peace. Some people say that he took a silver shilling and put it where the tree had once been. Some people said that his wife baked a piece of soda bread and that was enough. Some people said that he planted a new tree. I don't know what it was. But whatever it was the right thing, because when he got back to the house, Liza was there in the house with all her family clustered around her, and they were trying to scrub her down and get her clean because she'd been gone for 3 weeks and she was covered in dirt. There was hawthorn leaves and twigs twisted into her hair, and she looked like a wild thing. And when they cleaned her up, they tried to get her to speak. But again, there was a problem there because, and it depends who's telling the story. My dad tells me it was a hawthorn leaf that sealed her lips. Another man told me that it was a piece of grass wrapped around her tongue and she was literally tongue-tied until they got the thing away. And then she told them that she'd been taken away by little people, the gentle people, and they'd been kind to her, they'd given her nice things to eat and showed her new dances and songs that no one in the district knew. And then, after a while, they'd simply brought her home again, without so much as a single scratch upon her. And when she told that story to her family and the neighbours, they said, "Look, Liza, if you go around telling people that the fairies have taken you away, people might think you're a little bit strange in the head. You've got to change that story." But you know what it's like when somebody's trying to get you to change your story and you believe it's true? You don't want to change it. And that's what she did. She stuck by that story. Nothing could get her to change her story. And in the end, people accepted that that was the story she was going to tell people, whether it was true or not. And eventually they called Liza McKillop the fairy girl. And she grew up. Well, she didn't actually grow very tall, because from that day onwards, even though she lived to be a very, very old lady, so her health was never affected, but she never grew 1 more inch from that day onwards till the last day of her life, many years later. And she was known later on as the fairy woman when she became a woman. And even when I was a little boy, she was still around. She was a very, very old lady then. And my Uncle James, who's not a young man now, he must be well into his 70s, he said that when he was a little boy, she seemed like she was an old lady then as well. So she'd been around for a long, long time. And she was the last person ever to be taken by the fairies in that glen. Apparently, it used to be quite a common event before then. You could be stolen by the fairies. Would you like to go and live with the fairies? Not even if they'd give you nice food and teach you nice things. Nah, it's better to stay at home where you know what's what, isn't it? But she was the last person to go and live with the fairies, so they say. And that is supposed to be a true story. Thank you. Thank you very much.